On a frozen night in 1975, a quiet street in Teaneck, New Jersey, became the front line of a war the public didn't even know existed. Behind one door was Frank Lucas, the Harlem kingpin who cut out the mafia and built an empire straight from the Golden Triangle. Outside, 20 armed agents waited to take it all. What they found inside would ignite headlines, shatter myths, and expose the most audacious smuggling claim in American history. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Teaneck, New Jersey, 1975. The air was brittle with winter, the kind that scraped your throat with each breath. And in the faint orange halo of the street lamps, the frost on the pavement shone like powdered glass. Somewhere nearby, the click of polished leather heels echoed through a church corridor, fading into the mechanical hum of DEA radios in the cold. A coffin was being lowered under dim light, its brass latch catching a glint that seemed to burn briefly and vanish. That latch, so ordinary in another world, had become a whispered emblem in law enforcement circles, a symbol of the most audacious smuggling claim Harlem had ever produced. And here, in the dead hours of January, a joint task force of DEA Group 22 agents and the NYPD's Organized Crime Control Bureau was about to breach the home of the man accused of it. The order had come down quietly but decisively. 20 men, 10 federal, 10 city, arrayed in 2 lines outside the Teaneck residence, the quiet suburban street lined with sleeping split-level houses that masked the scale of what was alleged to move through their midst. The wind brought with it the faint smell of salt from the Hudson and the metallic tang of gunmetal from the weapons resting ready in gloved hands. Inside, the lights were low, a single shaded lamp glowing in the living room. The man they were here for, Frank Lucas, had been the subject of a months-long investigation. His name passed through Gambino family informants who described him as the country boy who had bypassed the Italian pipeline and tapped the Golden Triangle directly. The New York Times would call it plainly, "Country Boys, called Number 1 Heroin Gang, is busted." But tonight, the presses hadn't yet rolled. Tonight was about the evidence. The door splintered inward under a battering ram, and the agents poured in with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed this a dozen times. Lucas was there, dressed in a dark suit despite the hour, his expression unreadable. "I am a businessman. I am anything I need to be at any time," he would say years later, according to a 2009 interview. In that moment, he simply stepped back, letting the tide of lawmen fill his home, the soft hum of a radio from another room playing the stylistics You Make Me Feel Brand New. Upstairs, drawers slid open. In the basement, the smell shifted. Less of winter air, more of cold concrete, canvas, and the stale odor of long-stored cash. The pivotal moment came when an agent in the den bent to unzip a plain brown suitcase. On top lay a small child's winter coat, the kind with wooden toggles and a fraying cuff. Beneath it, neat bricks of currency, each bound in crisp Federal Reserve straps, stacked with the geometric precision of military supply crates. The total counted in official reports would come to $584,683, a fortune in 1975, though Lucas would claim, then and for decades after, that 9 to 10 million had been taken, much of it never seen again. "It was the largest stash of cash I had ever seen," one DEA agent said in a 1975 interview, his voice still carrying a note of disbelief. Midway through the search, the scene shifted to the dining room table, now crowded with agents cataloguing watches, documents, and jewelry under the flickering light of a ceiling fixture. The chipped gold cufflink on Lucas's left wrist caught the glow. It had a small sliver of enamel missing, a flaw that seemed out of place against the otherwise meticulous presentation. From the kitchen came the smell of burnt coffee, left too long on the hot plate when the knock had come. A young woman, Julie Lucas, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes flicking from her husband to the agents with a look that mixed fury and calculation. Teaneck, New Jersey, mid-scene. The evidence bags were stacking up, their plastic crinkle loud in the stillness. Outside, snow began to fall, the flakes visible in the beam of a street lamp, melting on contact with the black hoods of unmarked cars. In the distance, the rumble of a bus on its late route was the only sound from the world beyond this address. For Lucas, this was a raid, yes, but it was also theatre. He had spent years crafting an image, a Harlem kingpin who dressed in tailored suits from Rome, who drove Lincolns and Cadillacs, but kept his public footprint quieter than the flamboyant figures before him. This moment was the collision point between that cultivated persona and the raw machinery of federal law enforcement. The agents moved methodically, every drawer and closet opened, every garment shaken out. In the master bedroom, an officer paused at a cedar chest, running his hand along its edge before lifting the lid. No drugs, only folded wool suits, and beneath them, a polished leather attaché case containing ledgers. The handwriting was neat, the columns precise. Dates, weights, payments. An accountant's clarity applied to illicit trade. The smell of cedar and old paper hung in the air. These were the ledgers that tied the street to the source, the kind of link prosecutors at the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York built careers on. Frank Lucas watched, his face a mask. Inside, he was already running calculations. What could be proved? What could be denied? What connections could be leveraged to blunt the blow? The broader organized crime landscape in 1975 was in flux. The French Connection pipeline had been fractured. The mafia was adapting, and black syndicates in Harlem were both empowered and endangered by their independence. Lucas had exploited that gap brilliantly, but in this dining room, under the steady scratch of pen on evidence forms, it was clear that gap was closing. His power status, in that instant, still the summit, but with storm clouds massing at the horizon. One agent, older, with a lined face and a Queen's accent, leaned in toward a younger colleague and murmured, "This guy's a ghost in the files. No one's touched him till now." That was the danger and the allure. Lucas had been a name more in whispers than in indictments. But this raid and the images that would follow would change that. The press would eat it up. A stoic kingpin in cuffs, a suburban fortress laid bare, the hint of soldiers' coffins and heroin sewn into the lining, a method Lucas swore by and his alleged partner Ike Atkinson swore was myth. The raid stretched into the early morning hours, the agents cycling out to warm themselves in cars before coming back in, boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum. Outside, the snow had turned the street into a muted landscape, every sound softened. Inside, the sharp scent of fingerprint powder mixed with the lingering aroma of cigarettes, a haze drifting under the kitchen light. The stylistic song had long since ended, replaced by the clack of typewriter keys in the temporary command post set up in the living room, each strike marking another item logged, another line in the story being written for the courts and inevitably for the papers. By the time the last piece of evidence was sealed, the first grey light of dawn was breaking through the curtains. The agents filed out, their breath visible in the cold, carrying boxes and bags past the coffin-like silhouette of the suitcase in the back of a van. Lucas was led to a waiting car, his overcoat collar turned up against the wind, the chipped cufflink catching the day's first glint. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. Not yet. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the brass latch of that coffin, real or imagined, was closing again, sealing away whatever truths would never make it to trial. In the distance, church bells began to toll, muffled in the snow, their rhythm echoing the slow lowering of that symbolic coffin in the opening moment. For Frank Lucas, this was not an ending, but a pivot, a shift from the invisibility he had cultivated to the spotlight he would now be forced to navigate. And as the unmarked car turned the corner, tires crunching on the icy street, the polished latch of that unseen coffin gleamed once more in the mind's eye, a reminder that in this world, every secret has its burial, and every burial leaves a trace. LaGrange, North Carolina, 1930. Morning fog rolled over the red clay roads like a slow tide, muffling the sound of the rooster crowing somewhere beyond the tree line. The damp earth gave off the smell of last night's rain, mingling with the acrid drift of wood smoke from the iron stove in the kitchen. Inside a narrow, weather-worn shotgun house, Mahalie Lucas poured coffee into a chipped enamel cup, her hands steady, though the steam made her eyes water. It was here, in this sparse home, lit by kerosene lamps and warmed by the fire's glow, that the eldest of 9 children sat on the edge of a wooden chair, staring at the floorboards as if they might answer the questions his young mind couldn't yet frame. Frank Lucas had been born into this world in 1930, son of Fred and Mahalie, at a time when the town's population barely filled a few dusty blocks. LaGrange was a place of tobacco fields, cotton gins, and the unspoken codes of Jim Crow that shaped every movement, every glance, every choice a black family made. His earliest memories were of chores that left dirt under his nails and sweat at the small of his back before the day's heat had even set in. There was never enough money, never enough food, and always the whisper that better could be found somewhere else, though somewhere else was a dangerous thing to seek. The defining moment came one summer day when Frank was 12. His cousin Obadiah, not much older than he was, had been accused, falsely, the family always insisted, of looking too long at a white girl on the main street. The men came at dusk, hoods white in the dying light, and the air that evening carried a smell Frank would never forget. Dust from wagon wheels and the faint sweetness of crushed pine needles under heavy boots. He didn't see the act itself. He saw the aftermath, the shape hanging from the old sycamore beyond the cornfields, the way the cicadas kept singing, as if nothing in the world had changed. In the kitchen that morning, Mahali's enamel cup clicked softly against the table as she set it down. She said nothing to Frank. She didn't have to. The silence between them carried the weight of 1,000 words they couldn't speak in a town like LaGrange. Later, he would recall in an interview, "After that day, I knew I'd never be poor again." Original Gangster, 2010. It was a vow forged not out of greed, but out of a 12-year-old's certainty that power was the only shield worth having. Frank's first steps toward that shield were small and local. Chickens went missing from coops, the largest eggs vanishing with them. Coins disappeared from coat pockets left hanging on porch hooks. He'd sell the birds or the eggs to neighbors a few streets over, using the nickels to buy penny candy he didn't even like, just to feel the weight of possession. At night, under the dim flicker of the oil lamp, he'd roll the coins over his knuckles, the metal warm from his skin. By 14, he'd graduated from chickens to bolder thefts, lifting food from the back of delivery wagons, slipping tobacco tins into the folds of his shirt. One humid July afternoon, the sound of cicadas rose to a pitch as Frank crouched behind the general store, heart pounding, a stolen tin pressed against his ribs. The air was thick with the scent of boiled peanuts sold from a cart on the corner. That day he was caught, the store owner's hand clamping down on his shoulder like an iron trap. The man dragged him inside, past shelves lined with mason jars, to wait for the local sheriff. The sheriff, a broad man with a sweat-damp Stetson, looked him over and shook his head. "Boys like him don't get second chances down here," he was heard to say, according to local accounts in the 1940s. But Frank got one, of a sort. His age spared him from the worst, though it didn't spare him the hours in the chain gang clearing ditches along Route 70, the blistered palms and the salt sting of sweat running into his eyes. It was work designed to teach humility. In Frank, it cultivated something else entirely: patience, and the knowledge that time could be endured if it meant the payoff was worth it. Midway through his teenage years, LaGrange began to feel smaller by the day. The same faces at the Sunday service, the same hymn, "Precious Lord, take my hand," sung slow and low, the voices carrying out into the warm air through open church windows. He'd stand near the back, the scent of starch from pressed dresses mingling with the beeswax polish on the pews, and think of all the places where nobody knew his name, where a man's worth might be measured in money, not lineage. By 16, he had clashed with an employer, the argument turning hot over short pay for long hours. In a flash of temper, Frank swung a pipe, leaving the man crumpled on the floor. The smell of oil and machine grease clung to his clothes as he rifled the office for cash, finding $400 in a drawer. He set a match to the ledger books before leaving, watching the pages curl black in the flame. The smoke followed him out into the night, thick and bitter in his nose. LaGrange, he would re-anchor here in memory when telling his story decades later, was the place that shaped his defiance. It was also the place he knew he had to leave if he wanted the kind of life that would make good on the vow he'd made at 12. The Great Migration was already carrying thousands northward, to Philadelphia, to Chicago, to New York. The rail line that cut through town became a lifeline for those ready to gamble on anonymity in exchange for opportunity. On the night he left, the platform lanterns cast long shadows on the gravel. Mahali stood back from the tracks, arms folded, her face unreadable in the flickering light. She pressed a cloth bundle into his hand, cornbread wrapped in wax paper, and said only, "Don't come back the same." The train hissed, a deep metallic sigh, and coal smoke curled into the humid air. As Frank climbed aboard, the rough wood of the carriage steps under his palms, the sound of the whistle cut through the night. In the doorway, he turned for one last look. The fog had started to settle again, the kind that softens every outline, blurs every edge. Somewhere far away in his mind, the glint of a coffin latch, seen in another time, another place, flashed like a signal. He was leaving the fields, the dust, the cicadas, but carrying the violence and the resolve with him. As the train pulled away, its rhythm steady and unhurried, the world of LaGrange fell into darkness behind him, and the long road to Harlem began under a sky heavy with the promise of storms. Harlem, New York City, 1946. The train clattered to a stop beneath the arched roof of Pennsylvania Station, its brakes screaming like some final warning before a threshold was crossed. The warm, soot-thick air of the station struck Frank Lucas in the face as he stepped down from the carriage, his hands still smelling faintly of the cornbread wrapped by his mother back in LaGrange. Outside, the city was already in motion. Trolley bells, taxi horns, the rush of voices in accents he had never heard back home. By the time he reached 125th Street in Harlem, the November night was alive with light and noise. The smell of hot pretzels from a cart by the subway entrance mixed with the exhaust of buses idling at the curb. On the corner, a man in a wide-brim hat was selling newspapers, calling out headlines in a voice that had the rasp of too many cigarettes. The blocks around 125th were a tide of energy. Men in double-breasted suits hurrying toward clubs, women in fur-collared coats drifting past storefront windows that caught and multiplied their reflections. Harlem was still in the glow of its cultural renaissance, though the war years had shifted its heartbeat toward a sharper, faster rhythm. Money moved here in ways Lucas had only dreamed about, in the flash of a ring on a hand, in a casual toss of bills onto a counter. In Harlem, money moved faster than the trains, he would say decades later, in original Gangster, 2010, the truth of it evident from his very first night. He found a room in a boarding house on 7th Avenue, peeling wallpaper, a thin mattress that smelled faintly of bleach, a single bulb hanging from a cord. From here, he began his education in the neighborhood's shadow economy. The first jobs were small, running packages for men who gave no receipts, carrying messages across blocks where you learned to walk fast but never run. By the end of his first month, he'd been introduced to an older hustler named Eddie, who had a nose for stolen goods and a smile that never reached his eyes. Eddie showed him where to fence watches, lifted from inattentive wrists, where a gold chain could vanish into a pawnbroker's drawer without a single question asked. On Saturdays, Lucas would station himself outside the Apollo Theater, where the crowd spilled out in a wave of laughter and perfume after a headliner's set. The plan was simple: work the edge of the crowd, brush close enough to feel the weight of a wallet or the cool metal of a watch chain. One cold night in January, a man turned just as Lucas's fingers closed around his billfold. For a split second, their eyes met. Lucas saw suspicion harden into recognition. And then the man shouted, the sound knifing through the noise of the street. Lucas bolted, the soles of his worn leather shoes slapping the wet pavement, one lace black and the other brown. He cut left into an alley, the smell of garbage thick in the air, and didn't stop running until the shouts had faded into the clatter of the elevated line above. Midway through that first year, Lucas had mapped the rhythms of 125th Street. In the afternoons, the pool halls were thick with smoke and the clack of cue balls. Men hunched over tables in tailored vests, cigars clenched between their teeth, while side bets changed hands in folded bills. Women passed through in twos and threes, their perfume leaving a wake of lilac or rosewater. It was here that he overheard two men arguing about who ran the block, a reminder that every stretch of sidewalk, every corner, had its own boss and its own rules. Every block had its own boss and its own rules, an NYPD Organized Crime Control Bureau veteran would later recall in a 1950s oral history, describing exactly the kind of world Lucas was learning to navigate. One evening, the warm glow of Billie Holiday's voice spilled from the doorway of a club on 8th Avenue, Good Morning Heartache, as Lucas leaned against the brick wall, watching cars pull up and unload men whose suits looked like they'd been cut in another country. A Buick Roadmaster idled at the curb, its chrome catching the neon from the sign overhead. The driver, a man with shoulders like a dock worker's and a fedora pulled low, scanned the sidewalk with the calm of someone who knew exactly who was allowed near his passenger. This was the kind of proximity Lucas craved, not the petty lift of a wallet, but the weight of a conversation that could lead to a seat at the table where real deals were made. It was during one of these nights that Lucas claimed to have met Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man many in Harlem called the Black Godfather. Whether the meeting happened exactly as Lucas told it is still disputed. Johnson's widow would later suggest that Lucas's proximity to her husband had been exaggerated, but what mattered to Lucas was the impression. The idea of a man who could keep the Italians at bay, who could walk 125th Street without looking over his shoulder. Bumpy's tailored overcoats, his precise diction, the way he commanded a room without raising his voice. These were lessons in power that Lucas absorbed like scripture. Harlem, mid-scene, was where Lucas learned to measure opportunity by the hour. He spent mornings in the back booths of diners, the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee seeping into his clothes, listening to older men talk about numbers, rackets, and the week's action. Afternoons were for running errands that doubled as reconnaissance, learning who owed who, which shopkeepers paid for protection, and which ones had friends in the 28th precinct. Nights belonged to the clubs, where the band's horn section hit notes that rattled in your chest, and the dancers' sequins caught the light in 1,000 points. His break into more serious work came after Eddie vouched for him to a small-time bookmaker named Lou Parsons. Lou ran his action out of the back of a candy store, a smell of sugar and licorice masking the tension that hummed in the narrow room. Lucas's job was to carry envelopes from Lou to a man down on Lenox Avenue, never taking the same route twice, never lingering at the handoff. The first time he felt the thickness of an envelope, the crisp edges of stacked bills inside, he understood why men took risks for money. By the winter of 1949, Lucas had shed the mismatched laces and the thin overcoat from LaGrange. He moved through Harlem with a confidence born of knowing which faces to nod to, which to avoid, and which to memorize. The city had a way of remaking a man, sanding off the soft edges until only the ambition was left. He was still small-time, still moving in the orbit of men whose reach dwarfed his own. But each deal, each escape from the law, each night that ended with cash in his pocket, was a step toward the kind of shield he'd sworn to build back in North Carolina. On a quiet Sunday night, he stood again beneath the elevated line, the metallic rattle of the train overhead pulling his eyes upward. He thought of the train that had brought him here, the fields he'd left behind, and the vow made under a sycamore tree's shadow. The city roared around him, but in that moment, all he heard was the steady rhythm of steel on steel, carrying him toward a future he was determined to claim. Harlem, 1960s. The elevated train's metallic rattle faded into the softer, slower rhythm of domino tiles slapped onto a scarred wooden table in the back room of a corner bar on 126th Street. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, the kind that clung to your clothes for days, curling in lazy ribbons toward a yellowed ceiling. At the head of the table sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, broad-shouldered, precise in his speech, and always wearing an overcoat cut sharp enough to look at home in Midtown, but worn proudly here, in the neighborhood he had ruled for decades. His voice was calm, measured, but every man at that table leaned forward when he spoke. Frank Lucas, still not the man he would one day become, watched from the edge of the room, taking in everything. How Bumpy didn't need to raise his voice to make his point, how a slight nod could dismiss an idea, how silence could be as potent as a threat. By the time Lucas would tell his story years later, this was the chapter he liked to linger on. Bumpy taught me it's better to own the block than burn it down, he allegedly said in original Gangster, shaping his memory into a lesson about control and longevity. The truth of their closeness has been contested. Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's widow, and journalist Ron Chapesiuk have both suggested Lucas exaggerated his proximity to Harlem's most famous crime boss. Still, Lucas held on to the idea of being mentored by a man who could keep the peace between Harlem's black operators and the Italian mafia's Genovese and Gambino families, a man who could walk Lenox Avenue in daylight and never break stride. Wells Restaurant at 132nd Street and 7th Avenue was one of Bumpy's haunts, a place where the coffee was strong and the eggs came out fast. On a summer morning in July 1968, the low murmur of breakfast conversations was broken only by the faint metallic scrape of a knife spreading butter on toast. Lucas remembered sitting a few tables away, the jukebox in the corner quietly spinning Ray Charles's Here We Go Again. He said he was watching Bumpy's reflection in the glass door when the older man suddenly froze, the toast slipping from his fingers. The sound of the knife clattering onto the formica table was sharp enough to turn heads. Bumpy's coffee cup tipped, leaving a perfect ring of condensation on the tabletop, a small, ordinary detail that would mark the exact spot where Harlem's balance of power shifted. The official accounts say Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack that morning. Whether Lucas was there in the moment or heard about it, minutes later, remains part of the disputed record, but the outcome was undeniable. The ambulance took him to Harlem Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. That afternoon, the New York-Amsterdam News would run the headline, "With Johnson gone, Harlem's balance of power tilted overnight. The Italians, always watching for weakness, were ready to press their advantage. The younger independents, hungry and untested, saw a door swinging open. Lucas knew enough by then to recognize the danger in a vacuum. Harlem, for all its music and color, was a place where the rules were set by the man who could enforce them. Without Bumpy, those rules would be contested block by block. On the streets outside Wells, the smell of fried chicken from a nearby luncheonette mingled with the gasoline exhaust of idling cabs. Men leaned in doorways, smoking and speculating. Some swore the Italians would move in before Bumpy was even buried. Others whispered about who among the black operators had the connections, the discipline, and the nerve to claim the role of mediator that Bumpy had embodied. The funeral drew the curious and the loyal alike. Mamie Johnson stood near the casket, her dress a simple dark navy, her expression composed but impenetrable. Lucas was there too, standing a few paces back, watching the way people approached her with a mix of respect and wariness. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, nearly masking the musty undertone of the funeral home's carpet. Outside, hearses lined the curb, and a small crowd gathered, murmuring about the old days when Bumpy could walk into a precinct and have a man released with nothing more than a handshake. Mid-scene, Harlem's geography reasserted itself. The street was already shifting in tone, more plainclothes detectives lingering near corners, more unfamiliar faces behind the wheels of big American sedans. The Italians weren't taking over in force. They didn't need to. They had the heroin supply lines, the political connections, and the patience to let the local players scrap until exhaustion made them pliable. Lucas, if he truly had been close to Bumpy, would have known this was the moment to choose a path. Bend under the existing structure or find a way to bypass it entirely. He chose the second. The idea that would define his career was not yet fully formed, but the outline was there. Cut out the middlemen, go to the source. In later years, he'd point to the months after Bumpy's death as the time when he began quietly laying the groundwork for that plan, watching as others jostled for short-term control. He stayed visible, but not flashy, moving in and out of clubs where the deals were being made, keeping his ear to the ground in pool halls and on street corners. The Ray Charles song from that morning at Wells seemed to follow him in memory. Here we go again, she's back in town again. A reminder that cycles repeat, that power vacuums don't stay empty. One night, standing outside a bar on 8th Avenue, Lucas lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl away, thinking of Bumpy's cigars and the way the older man would let the ash grow long before flicking it away. The smoke drifted upward, disappearing into the Harlem night, as if marking the end of an era that would never return. By autumn of 1968, the cigar smoke that once signaled Bumpy's presence on a block was gone, but its absence was its own message. Someone else would fill that space. And soon. Lucas walked the same streets, passing the same restaurants and bars, but now the eyes that followed him were measuring him differently. No longer as a runner, but as a man who might be planning something larger. In the reflection of a shop window, he saw himself in a suit a little sharper than last year's, standing a little straighter, and knew that whatever came next, he intended to own more than a block. Outside the funeral home weeks earlier, he had watched the hearse's trunk close with a soft, final thump, a sound muffled but unmistakable. That sound stayed with him, as tangible as the ring of coffee cup condensation on the table at Wells. In the quiet moments, it echoed back to the first day he'd seen Bumpy across a table, the air thick with cigar smoke, the dominoes falling one by one. That smoke was gone now, and with it, the last visible shield between Harlem's street operators and the open jaws of the larger underworld. Bangkok, Thailand, late 1960s. The last curl of Harlem cigar smoke seemed to dissolve into the humid night air half a world away, replaced by the smell of fish sauce, diesel exhaust, and street-side charcoal fires. Neon signs flickered in English, Thai, and French, the reflections bending across rain-slick pavement as tuk-tuks rattled past, with a sound like loose change in a metal box. Somewhere in the warren of Soa, narrow side streets, Frank Lucas walked with his jacket collar turned up, the damp heat sticking his shirt to his back. He had traded the cold, ordered chaos of Harlem for a city that pulsed day and night, where the alleyways could hide anything, including the business he had come to pursue. The United States was deep in the Vietnam War, and Bangkok had become a rest and resupply hub for American servicemen, contractors, and anyone who could make money off them. Lucas claimed he had been brought here by Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former US Army Master Sergeant with an easy grin and a Rolodex that seemed to stretch across every base in Southeast Asia. Ike knew everyone over there, every black guy in the army, Lucas would later recall, framing their meeting as the hinge on which his empire would swing. Atkinson himself told a different story, insisting in a 2007 New York Times interview that they never used coffins to move heroin. We used furniture, not coffins. That coffin stories are myth. The meeting that began their partnership took place in a dim Bangkok cafe off Sukhumvit Road. A single ceiling fan turned lazily, pushing warm air around the room. Lucas sat with his hands folded on the table, condensation dripping down the side of a bottle of Singer beer and pooling into a wet ring on the wood. Across from him, Atkinson leaned back, his short-sleeved khaki shirt crisp despite the humidity. Between them lay a plain manila folder, its contents, contacts, routes, costs. More valuable than anything Lucas had handled before. Outside, the sound of a transistor radio drifted in through the open door. Cliff Richard's congratulations, tinny but unmistakable. This was the pitch. Cut out the middlemen in Marseille, sidestep the mafia's French connection, and go straight to the source. The Golden Triangle, where the borders of Burma, Laos, and Thailand formed a rough wedge of jungle and mountain that produced the purest heroin in the world. Atkinson had the introductions, the cover, and the transport. Lucas had the money and the will. The mechanics were simple in theory and dangerous in execution. Buy directly from producers, process locally, and move the product back to the States hidden inside military supply shipments. Lucas's version would make the method infamous. Who the hell's gonna look in a dead soldier's coffin? He allegedly told Original Gangster. Whether it was coffins, furniture, or some combination, the goal was the same: invisibility. Midway through the deal-making weeks, Lucas followed Atkinson north into the Golden Triangle. The further they traveled from Bangkok, the narrower the roads became, winding through hills that smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. In a clearing near the Mekong, he saw the raw beginnings of what would become his fortune. Burlap sacks of opium stacked beside an open-sided hut, where barefoot workers moved with the steady rhythm of those who had done the same task for years. Inside, the acrid chemical stench of morphine base hit like a slap, stinging the eyes and coating the tongue. It was here that Lucas understood the scale. Hundreds of kilos at a fraction of the New York price, pure enough to make blue magic more than a name. Bangkok, mid-scene. The operation's other half was already in motion. On the tarmac of a US military airbase, forklifts moved crates marked for shipment to stateside installations. The line between official cargo and contraband was a thin one, blurred by favors, payoffs, and the complicity of men who looked the other way. Lucas stayed well back from the loading area, preferring to watch through the open slats of a storage shed. A Thai fixer named Somchai, thin as a reed and always chewing betel nut, worked the periphery, passing quiet instructions to a pair of men in fatigues. Somchai had been the bridge between Atkinson and the local suppliers, his presence a reminder that in this part of the world, nothing happened without layers of intermediaries. The plan was as much about discipline as daring. Lucas understood that a single exposed shipment could collapse everything. He spent nights in a rented room near Klong Toei port, going over details by the light of a single lamp while the harbour smell of brine and diesel seeped through the shutters. Outside, the city never really slept. Vendors frying late-night snacks, distant bursts of laughter from bars, the clink of glasses, and the muffled thud of jukeboxes. He absorbed it all, but his focus stayed on the chain that would stretch from these docks back to Harlem. It was a chain that relied on the churn of the Vietnam War. Planes and ships moved daily between Southeast Asia and the United States, carrying supplies for soldiers whose tours were measured in months, not years. In the chaos of war logistics, a few extra crates, or a few altered ones, were invisible. This was organized crime's version of piggybacking on a superhighway, and the US government itself was unwittingly paving the road. By the time Lucas boarded a plane back to New York, the first shipments were already in motion. He flew coach, alone, wearing a modest suit and carrying nothing that would draw attention. The real cargo would follow behind him, hidden in containers that no customs officer was likely to pry open. At JFK, the cold hit him like a slap after weeks of humid air. But the smell of jet fuel was the same, and the low, metallic thud of a cargo container door closing on the tarmac might as well have been the sound of a coffin lid sealing. A sound he'd never admit gave him a private thrill. That sound would echo in his memory for years, carrying with it the heat of Bangkok nights, the chemical sting of the processing huts, and the weight of that first Singer beer sweating on the cafe table. while he shook hands on a deal that would redefine Harlem's drug economy. Harlem, early 1970s. The heavy metallic thud of the cargo container lid in Bangkok seemed to reverberate across oceans until it became the groan of a crowbar prying open a wooden crate in a dim Harlem back room. The smell that rose up from inside was unmistakable to anyone in the business. A dry, earthy perfume of burlap, raw opium, and the faint chemical tang that meant the powder had been worked into its final, lethal purity. Frank Lucas stood close enough to see the pale bricks stacked like loaves of bread, each stamped with a simple blue logo. Blue Magic was born here, not in some marketing office, but in the low light of a stash house a block off 125th Street, where every man in the room knew they were looking at something that would change the streets. The first shipment had come through exactly as planned, bypassing the Italians, bypassing the French connection, bypassing every middleman who had ever skimmed a profit from Harlem's desperation. Lucas had cut the price and raised the quality, a move so counter to the accepted logic of the trade that it drew both admiration and rage. People wanted my dope because it was clean. I protected that, he would say later in original Gangster, a mixture of pride and calculation in his voice. He wasn't exaggerating. The purity tested at 98 to 100%. Dealers didn't have to cut it much, if at all, which meant addicts came back not just for the high, but for the reliability. The first bag of Blue Magic to hit the streets went to a mid-level dealer Lucas trusted implicitly, a man named Freddie Price. Freddie was the kind of figure who could walk through Lenox Avenue in a camel hair coat and never draw heat, loyal, efficient, and quick to spot trouble before it reached his doorstep. On that cold afternoon, Lucas met him outside a record shop, the glass windows rattling faintly to Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues spilling from a Cadillac parked nearby. Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat, pulled out a small waxed bag, and handed it over without a word. The streetlight caught the face of his gold watch, sending a flash across Freddie's palm as he closed his fingers over it. That was the micro detail, the almost incidental moment that in hindsight marked the start of an empire. Midway through that winter, the street felt different. The corner hustlers had product they could count on, and the flow of money showed in small ways. Better clothes, flashier cars, a little more swagger in the way men stood on a stoop. Lucas ran his operation from a quiet office above a used furniture store, the hum of fluorescent lights constant in the background. On certain afternoons, the air was filled with the rhythmic clatter of money-counting machines, their sound muffled under the chatter of lieutenants reporting on sales, shortages, and rumors from other boroughs. Maps were pinned to the wall: Harlem, the Bronx, Newark, each marked with neat colored tacks to show where his product moved fastest. Lucas was a businessman in the truest sense. He kept ledgers, he kept people in line, and he kept a firm firewall between his public image and the machinery of his trade. A judge would later call his network one of the most outrageous international dope smuggling gangs ever, a statement that carried as much awe as condemnation. The money poured in. At the height, Lucas claimed to have $52 million deposited in Cayman Islands banks, and perhaps 1,000 kilos of heroin on hand. Even halving those numbers left him in a league most dealers never touched. Street, Harlem, mid-scene. The distribution was a ballet of precision. Freddie Price would arrive at a predetermined corner, his camel hair collar up against the wind, and within minutes, a different man would leave carrying a gym bag with the week's supply. From there, it would filter down to the street-level sellers, each under strict instructions. No cutting, no underweight bags, no freelancing with competitors. Violations were dealt with quietly but decisively, and word spread fast enough that few tried twice. Lucas understood that his brand depended not just on quality, but on control. Culturally, the city was in the grip of an escalating heroin crisis. Overdose deaths were climbing. Newspapers printed photographs of junkies slumped on stoops in broad daylight, their belts tied off on their arms. The epidemic was hollowing out neighborhoods, but in the same breath, the collapse of the Italian monopoly meant that for the first time, a black-run operation was setting the terms of the market. It was a dangerous kind of pride, the sort that drew both community resentment and grudging respect. Inside Lucas's own home, the mood was different. The hiss of a gas burner in the kitchen signaled a meal in progress. Pasta one night, steak the next, prepared by a cook who kept the household as orderly as the business. Lucas liked to eat in calm surroundings. The street's noise kept outside. He would sit at the table, his jacket off, the weight of the day's ledgers resting in his mind. He knew every figure, every route, every man on his payroll. By the end of 1972, Blue Magic had reached far beyond Harlem. Packages turned up in Newark, Philadelphia, even as far south as North Carolina. The money-counting machines ran longer hours. The office walls grew more crowded with tacked-up maps, and the hum of fluorescent lights felt like the pulse of the operation itself. Yet Lucas never lost the habit of inspecting product himself. Once a month, he would stand in the stash house as a bag was opened, run a fingertip through the powder, and bring it to his tongue, not to taste in the usual sense, but to feel its texture, the way a baker might test flour. In those moments, the smell of burlap and opium was as strong as it had been the night the first crate arrived. It was the scent of money, of risk, of a business that could not last forever, but that for now seemed unassailable. Outside, the streets were moving to the beat of Marvin Gaye, the hum of engines, the calls of dealers working the edges of the crowd. Inside, Lucas kept his watchful rhythm, the man who had turned a crate from a distant cargo yard into a brand that defined an era. When the last bag of that first shipment was gone, the crate itself sat empty in the corner of the stash house, its wood splintered and stained from travel. It was just an object now, but to Lucas, it was a reminder, a container that had carried the seeds of his rise, a hollow shell like the city streets he was filling. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the sound of that lid opening in the dim Harlem light was still playing, as vivid as the thud that had closed it half a world away. New York City, mid-1970s. The empty shipping crate that once carried the first wave of blue magic now sat gathering dust in a Harlem stash house. But in a cinder-block room 4 miles downtown, its ghost was being resurrected in a different form. Here, the air smelled of burnt coffee, left too long on a hot plate, of Lucky Strike smoke curling from an ashtray piled high beside a humming reel-to-reel recorder. The low, steady whir of magnetic tape filled the pauses between muffled voices as a team of DEA Group 22 agents and NYPD Organized Crime Control Bureau detectives leaned in, straining to catch the words of a man who had built his fortune on being invisible. Frank Lucas didn't know it yet, but his voice, clipped, careful, still heavy with the Carolina cadence, was bleeding through a wire hidden in a Harlem club's back room. The task force had learned that his lieutenants preferred to talk business over music, where the bass could swallow a phrase, and the laughter of patrons could turn a sentence into static. But under the right filters, the words came through, quantities, dates, coded references that were only thinly disguised. One agent tapped the page of his notepad with a pencil as the reel turned. "You can't fight what you can't see coming," Lucas would later write in Original Gangster. In these rooms, unseen was becoming visible. Surveillance didn't stop at Harlem's borders. In Teaneck, New Jersey, where Lucas's home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, unmarked cars parked at the corners. The detectives inside watched for patterns, deliveries at odd hours, unfamiliar visitors, trips that started with a leather briefcase and ended without it. Cameras clicked behind tinted glass. Back in the city, plainclothes officers drifted in and out of bars and restaurants Lucas was known to favor, their jackets smelling faintly of the same cigarette brands as the regulars, their eyes always scanning. Midway through that summer, the agents caught a break. A low-level associate of Lucas's was picked up in a small bust in the Bronx, half an ounce in his pocket, and the fear of a long sentence heavy on his shoulders. In the task force office, the man sat across from 2 investigators. The muffled thump of the Temptations' Papa Was a Rolling Stone seeping from a radio down the hall. Faced with the choice between prison and cooperation, he agreed to wear a wire. The microphone, no bigger than a shirt button, was sewn into the lining of his jacket. The next time he met with one of Lucas's lieutenants, the sound on the tape was a mix of street noise, laughter, and the mid-range hum of a jukebox. But buried in it were the words the agents needed, confirmations of shipment arrivals, hints at storage locations. They cross-referenced these with wiretap logs, slowly assembling a map of the network that until now had been little more than rumor and conjecture. Harlem, mid-scene. The dealers kept working the corners, their routines unchanged, their voices low. Lucas moved with the same calm precision as before, never appearing rattled, never letting the growing number of unfamiliar faces on the street change his pace. But inside the task force room, the picture was sharpening. Names were being linked to addresses to storage units to dates when cargo ships from Southeast Asia docked in New York Harbor. The cultural landscape was shifting against him. The dismantling of the French Connection had emboldened federal agencies. The success of RICO prosecutions was encouraging prosecutors to aim higher. Where once drug cases had focused on street-level arrests, strategy now was to climb the ladder, rung by rung, until the man at the top had nowhere left to stand. Informants became the grease for this climb, and Lucas's network, like any organization under pressure, had its weak links. In October 1975, the investigation reached a turning point. Through months of combined wiretaps, informant tips, and physical surveillance, the task force secured a search warrant for Lucas's Teaneck home. The raid would make headlines the next day. Drug lord found with 500. But in the hours before it began, the task force room was quiet, except for the steady spin of the reel-to-reel. One agent poured stale coffee into a paper cup, the steam mixing with the cigarette haze. Another checked the Polaroid camera, ensuring there was film loaded. The plan was simple: hit hard, document everything, leave nothing to challenge in court. Teaneck, New Jersey. Re-anchor. Dawn came grey and cool. The street was still, save for the muffled crunch of boots on asphalt, as 20 men in plain clothes and raid jackets took position. Inside, Lucas had just started his day. The sound of the battering ram against the door was followed by the rush of footsteps, the clipped shouts of police and federal agents. Drawers were pulled open, suitcases unzipped, closets emptied. In one room, a suitcase under a child's winter coat revealed stacks of cash, each bundle wrapped in crisp Federal Reserve bands. It was the largest stash of cash I had ever seen, one DEA agent would recall in a later interview, his voice still carrying the echo of that morning's disbelief. In the dining room, evidence was laid out on the table under the stark glare of overhead light. Jewelry, documents, bank slips, ledgers. The Polaroid camera snapped again and again, each print developing slowly in the air, thick with paper dust and the faint scent of the agent's aftershave. Upstairs, another team catalogued clothing, finding custom suits alongside more practical streetwear. Every item went into a bag, tagged and logged. By the time the sun was fully up, the evidence van had been loaded. In the task force room back in the city, the same reel-to-reel that had caught Lucas's voice now sat still, its tape full of the words and pauses that would be pored over by prosecutors. The ashtray was full again, coffee cups half empty. The Polaroid photos spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle whose edges had finally been found. The metallic click of the recorder's stop button sounded almost like a latch closing, the tape reels slowing to a final halt. In its own way, it echoed the sound of that container lid half a world away, sealing up a shipment. But here, it was sealing up something else entirely. The collected sounds, images, and paper trails that would, for the first time, make Frank Lucas visible to the courts. Manhattan, 1976. The money counted in Teaneck was now sealed in evidence lockers, each stack of bills photographed and logged. In the federal courthouse at Foley Square, the scent of lemon polish clung to the marble corridors, masking the faint smell of damp wool from the overcoats hanging in the crowded lobby. The sound of shoes, wingtips and pumps clicked over the terrazzo floor as lawyers, clerks and reporters moved toward a courtroom where a man once called the Invisible King of Harlem would now be seen by 12 jurors, day after day, until a verdict stripped the invisibility away. Frank Lucas entered, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, the cut still speaking of money and taste, even after months in custody. His hair was neatly combed, his posture unbowed, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room. Jurors shifting in their seats, reporters uncapping pens, the prosecutors leafing through their case files. Somewhere in the back row, his wife Julie sat with her hands clasped in her lap, a stillness in her that belied the whirlwind outside these walls. The first sensory beat hit as the clerk called the court to order, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the soft whir of a tape recorder set to capture every word. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Winters rose for the opening statement, his voice carrying just enough to reach the farthest bench without losing its edge. "This case," he began, "is about a man who brought poison into our communities, not in ounces, but in kilograms. Not on street corners, but through an international supply chain that treated lives like currency." In the first row of the press section, a reporter from the New York Times jotted the phrase down. It would appear the next morning under the headline, "Lucas Drug Trial Opens with Allegations of International Conspiracy." The framing was deliberate. The prosecution wanted jurors thinking about scope and scale from the first hour. The defense, led by attorney Murray Richmond, countered with calm precision. "My client," he said, "is no saint, but he is not the mastermind the government wants you to believe. The story they will tell you is stitched together from the words of informants, men facing decades behind bars, who suddenly found their memories convenient when offered a deal." Day after day, the evidence came forward. The second sensory beat arrived midway through the trial, when the government introduced the physical exhibits, the Polaroid photographs from the raid, still smelling faintly of the chemicals from their development. The ledgers in Lucas's own hand, their ink faded in places where fingers had smudged the margins. A DEA agent testified, holding up the leather suitcase found in Teaneck, the weight of the cash inside making the metal clasps strain. The informant who had worn the wire took the stand under heavy guard, his voice low but steady as he recounted conversations from Harlem bars, the coded language that only made sense in hindsight. "They trusted me," he said, glancing once toward Lucas. "I guess I should have been more scared than I was." By the third week, the trial had become a fixture in the city's daily rhythm. On the streets of Harlem, opinions split. Some saw Lucas as a businessman brought down by an unfair system. Others called it overdue justice. In Little Italy, whispers traveled through cafes that if the feds could bring down Lucas, maybe no one was untouchable. The cultural context was impossible to ignore. This was the mid-70s, when RICO had become the sharpest knife in the prosecutor's drawer, and drug kingpins were being targeted with the same intensity once reserved for mob bosses. Mid-scene re-anchor, Foley Square, February 1976. The wind funneled through the plaza between the courthouse and the federal building, snapping at reporters' overcoats as they smoked their cigarettes between sessions. Inside, the defense began its turn, calling character witnesses who spoke of Lucas's generosity, the college tuition he had paid for neighborhood kids, the bills he had covered for families in trouble. The prosecution countered with mothers whose children had overdosed on heroin traced back to Blue Magic, their voices breaking as they spoke. One vivid moment landed during cross-examination of a key lieutenant. Pressed about his role in arranging shipments from Southeast Asia, the man finally said, "We were soldiers in a war that didn't have a flag," a line that rippled through the press coverage the next day. And then came the micro detail, the faint squeak of the witness chair every time he shifted, a sound that seemed to underscore each evasive answer. The closing arguments brought both sensory and symbolic weight. Winters leaned on the jury rail, his voice dropping low. No matter how sharp the suit, no matter how polished the words, the truth is in the evidence. You've seen it. You've heard it. Now it's your turn to speak through your verdict. Richmond replied with a warning about government overreach and the danger of convicting on the word of compromised men. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the waiting, the courtroom felt suspended. Reporters tapping typewriter keys in the hall, lawyers pacing, Lucas sitting at the defense table, fingers steepled under his chin. When the verdict finally came, guilty on multiple counts of narcotics distribution and conspiracy, the third sensory beat was the collective exhale in the room, the scrape of the jury box gate opening, the low murmur swelling in the gallery. Outside, under a pale winter sun, reporters shouted questions. One DEA agent, speaking to a microphone, said simply, "Harlem's balance of power just shifted." Inside, Lucas nodded once, as though acknowledging an inevitable turn. A symbolic echo tied back to the trial's opening. Just as the prosecutors had polished their marble corridors for the jury's first walk-in, now the same halls would carry the footsteps of a man on his way to sentencing, a path polished by evidence, testimony, and the slow grind of federal justice. Harlem train yard echoes faded behind him as he emerged into the harsh light of Rikers Island. Early 1984, New York City, 1984. The sound of a jangling shuttle bus doors folded into the metallic hiss of the prison gates closing behind him. And instantaneously, sunlight turned unfamiliar, a glare that made every line in his face sharper. This was not the sunlight of a king, but that of an exile returning to daylight after a second fall. The air tasted of ozone and commercial cleaner. Inside the holding area, the scent of stale sandwich crusts mingled with disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the dulled, perfumed air of his former Harlem days. Frank Lucas, once the architect of Blue Magic, stood older, thinner, his tailored suits replaced by an ill-fitting prison jumpsuit. His joints were stiff, his frame bent slightly inward from years of confinement. This was his second major loss, a decisive blow, unlike any the streets had delivered. He'd been caught trying to exchange heroin and money for cocaine, crossing lines even his ambition likely warned him against. The court saw it clearly. In 1984, another conviction, 7 years added to the ledger of a life spent in cells. He would later admit, "I probably did more damage than I did good. It was a horrible business." Newark Star Ledger, 2013. With time served in 1981, thanks to his earlier cooperation, he'd tasted freedom. But now, those days returned in fragments. Muted laughter of cellmates, the rattle of the chow hall tray sliding across steel, the sharp clang of lockdown. A guard slid a thin slab of bread across the tray in front of him, the wax paper crackle under his fingers jolting a memory of cash bundles wrapped in Federal Reserve straps. The scene was both mundane and surreal. 7 years he spent again behind bars felt longer this time. No longer the strategist who governed Harlem with whispered instructions. He was now one of many in Orange, rotated through shifts, counts, and brief flashes of yard lights. But in the quiet nights, when the overhead fluorescent buzz died, he'd let his mind replay that blue magic packaging, the blue stamped bricks, the gold watch flash during the handoff. In solitary reflection, that memory nourished both regret and longing. In 1991, he stepped into daylight again. New York City, 1991. The gate opened, and he blinked against a sky that felt both endless and strangely fragile. A car idled in the lot outside, engine rumbling low. His legs felt like lead under the weight of a cheap off-white suit a supporter had provided, baggy and mismatched in tone to his skin. He gripped a cane in one hand, feather light, but it felt like an anchor. Around him, the world had shifted. Crack overtook heroin in neighborhoods. Bloodier turf wars replaced his quiet empire of purity with chaos. Blue storefronts on 116th and 125th Street were boarded or painted over. The name Blue Magic was just peeling paint on brick now, nothing more. Birdsong dripped from a tree nearby, notes clear and alive. It was a sound he didn't expect to remember feeling so sharply. The once hyperactive city sounded slow. Cars, distant sirens, the hiss of a passing bus. He raised his cane, steadying himself as he walked past the boarded storefront, the peeling paint a visual metaphor for his empire. Beautiful once, now hollow. Within these few years, he had gone from kingpin to empty storefront survivor. The drug landscape had pivoted. Crack wasn't pure, just fast and deadly. Bloodlines and block wars replaced the careful supply chain he once established. His network fractured. Middlemen he once bypassed now prospered under different names. The purity he protected was drowned out by speed, quantity, and expendability. Psychologically, Lucas carried ghosts of his own ambition. His ambition had delivered him an empire, but also the ruin. One-line power snapshot, once the summit of Harlem's heroin trade, now a husk navigating a city that no longer knew or valued the man he'd been. He turned toward the car, waiting for him, someone to drive him home. In his right pocket, beneath the folds of the cheap suit, was a folded federal disability check envelope, money from a world that didn't respect what it cost him. As the car door closed around him, the smell of worn leather seats enveloped him, transporting him backward and forward in the same breath. The light outside shifted, carrying the hiss of passing traffic inside. He exhaled, the air tasting like old coffee and warm dreams, as he pondered how to reclaim something, dignity, identity, maybe even redemption. Newark, 2012. The sound of the wheelchair's casters against grimy linoleum echoed first, giving way to the drone of a fluorescent cafe light that flickered with indifferent persistence. The air carried the faint aroma of burnt coffee and sanitizer, a muted reminder that even the most ordinary days could be the hardest to live. Frank Lucas sat hunched in his wheelchair, a wheelchair that seemed to bear every ounce of weight his years had collected. In his hands lay a folded federal disability check, $17,000, meant to bridge the gap left by a system that had long since taken more than it gave. It was his second attempt today to cash it, the teller at the counter glancing at him with soft concern. Her eyes lingered on his wrinkled hands, the veins like roads mapping a life that had traveled more than most. The scanner beeped, sharp, transactional, yet her face softened, as though mercy might be found between the lines of policy. The scene was buffered by low chatter, the scuff of chairs, the distant hiss of car engines through the cafe window, and the dull fluorescent light casting down with impartial bleakness. Lucas's voice whispered over this scene, a line both confession and plea. You leave that life out there. You cross the threshold of your home and that's it. Don't bring any of that into your home. Ever. Original Gangster, 2010. In those words lay a fracture between his public myth and his personal reality, between the roaring empire he once orchestrated and the twilight of small checks and weary legs. He was no longer the summits of power he climbed decades before, but a remnant clipped gently into the present. In 2012, he pleaded guilty to a minor federal offense, cashing the check twice. and was sentenced not behind bars, but to probation. The courtroom was quiet that morning, but inside Lucas's heart, the linger of guilt hummed low, a resonant reminder that his life had been defined by choices that still echoed, even in the hush. The teller slid the disbursement across. The check was credited. Outside, the world turned. Traffic droned. Pigeons cooed on fire escapes. The wind tugged at stray papers carried off sidewalks. Lucas rolled toward the door and out into the afternoon, his cane clustered with his frame, the old storefronts of Newark sliding past, some boarded up, paint peeling, shadows pooling at their fronts. At home, he would sit, looking at memories not as trophies, but as curators. Pictures of a daughter on the mantel, dried rose petals from long-ago celebrations. The hallway lamp's glow would pool at his feet, uneasy light for the man who once lived by neon and power plays. Once, he built an empire with purity and precision. Now, he navigated disability forms and fatigue, each day a negotiation between what was and what remained. The consequences of a lifetime in crime were not courtrooms or headlines anymore, but tremors in his hands, the hollow echo of a name that had once carried power, now reduced to reflection. As the cafe's glass door swung shut behind him, his frame passed into the haze of late afternoon. A life that had carried bullets, coffins, fortunes, and betrayal was distilled into a fold of fabric and a small envelope. The hum of traffic rose behind him, a steady note that Robert Johnson might have called the crossroads. But Lucas was already a few paces farther on, into the terrain of regret and domestic longing. 2007, suburban Atlanta. The snap of a keyboard keystroke echoes softly through the pastel-lit home office, where afternoon light drifts lazily across a low-lit wall painted in muted blush. A framed photograph sits on a nearby shelf, showing a tiny, smiling girl against the backdrop of her father's tailored suit, a memory of laughter long ago. The air carries the fresh scent of linen draped across a chairback, and a quiet click as the mouse shifts to the soft logo of Yellow Brick Road's dog on the screen. These quiet details sit atop a tension that both unsettles and clarifies. Here is a daughter shaped by love, legacy, and the criminal mythology that tried to define her. Francine Lucas remains tethered to two conflicting worlds. On one side, a daughter with fond memories of pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories. Her father playful, present, affectionate. On the other, the public image of a violent kingpin who flooded Harlem with heroin and shattered families. She pulls the memory into focus. I remember him as a very incredibly loving father, she recalled to the producers of Narco Wars 2024. These words tremble with devotion and bewilderment. How can the tender man in her childhood mesh with the myth carved into headlines? The room breathes these contradictions. The muted afternoon light curves across her features. Her hands hover over the keyboard, poised on plans for the non-profit she founded, Yellow Brick Roads, a project born from her pain and intention. Its mission is gentle but resolute, to offer guidance and healing to children of incarcerated parents. The moral of my book is that every child should have the opportunity to live a fulfilling and prosperous life despite their circumstances, she explained in 2008. The name, Yellow Brick Roads, is a symbolic path toward hope in a journey strewn with loss and shame. She scrolls through a photo gallery on her site, images of children painting banners in sunny rooms, counselors folding their hands in support, the soft pastel walls echoing those of her own childhood safe space. Each image holds the shadow of where her life was once defined by notoriety. From the pink tranquility, she speaks into a microphone for an interview. That guy who pulled the trigger was some other person, not my dad. Her voice cracks here, tension rising where love and legacy collide. Francine's earliest years, the ones she can remember, were idyllic. ABC News in 2007 described her childhood as, like any other father. He cooked breakfast. He played with me. He was just like a regular dad. That normality frayed when FBI agents stormed their Teaneck, New Jersey home in 1975, sending them into chaos. She remembers being thrown to the floor as shouting, and suitcases of cash spilled across their rooms. She was 3, and trauma began knitting itself into her memory, fear that seeped into the foundation of identity. At 9, the family was relocated under witness protection. Her name changed, her voice silenced in classrooms where friends could not know. Glamour encapsulated this loneliness, exposing her past. It's like a wound you've covered over. Now I've got to take it off and scrape it clean. That scraping became a life's work. quietly pushing past shame toward healing. In this office, Francine types and pauses, battling heartbreak and determination in equal measure. The fresh scent of linen mingles with the tapping of keys, each click both echo and rebuke of her father's past deeds. Flat-screen light paints stories across her features, illuminating tears she will wrench back before they fall, because this is her story, not merely his. Addresses come through her sight, parents in prisons across America, children longing for connection, teachers seeking materials. She builds volunteer sessions, curricula for counseling, creative workshops turned safe spaces. Each session opens with the mantra, "You are not a criminal." Each child's eyes lift with recognition that their parents' choices don't define their future. Francine lifts a child's drawing, bees working together, a father returning from the place of timeout. The metaphor stung with memory. She co-wrote Daddy Be Good to translate her experience into gentleness for little ones. Now she returns that message. Love can survive, identity can rebuild, redemption can root. Still, the conflict remains. She recently watched American Gangster. In her mind, the film's narrative blurred truth and legend. She feared it would depict her father as pure evil, erasing complexity. But she also recognized the opportunity. Through visibility, she could reclaim the frame, contextualize the monster, humanize the man, and rebuild a reputation of her own design. This is why Yellow Brick Roads matters, not as son of a gangster, but as a daughter forging a path for children like her. Her office breathes determination. The pastel walls, the yellow brick leaflets on the desk, the logo glowing on screen, they all whisper forward. Her voice, measured but raw, offers final reflection. I didn't want to be seen as just my father's child. I am myself now. Behind her, a projector flickers to life, a soft beam illuminating dust in a slanted shaft. The image that appears is grainy. Denzel Washington as her father in American Gangster. The film's edges pulse in her eyes, tears gathering unbidden, the lines between myth and memory wavering. And as the clip plays, the light dances across her face, ushering out the tears and letting memory and legacy merge, quietly, irrevocably weaving her own legacy from the threads of both love and pain. Harlem's dim shadows fade into glossy red carpet lights. Los Angeles, 2007. A camera flash explodes like lightning, shutter clicks ringing through the moist air. Denzel Washington, in a tailored tux, stands inching towards an ornate stairway lined with velvet rope, desperate to become the man at its center. In another epoch, Frank Lucas, the man himself, flush with awe and hesitation, sits in a corner on set, leaning toward Washington as the actor adjusts the posture, the cadence of fear and empire under his skin. The curiosity gap opens. Here is the real Frank Lucas, watching a reimagining of his life, both complementing and contending with the fiction. The stale smell of popcorn clings to the theater corridor where the premiere unfolds. The scent mixes with the residual odor of fresh nail polish and camera spray. Muffled applause reverberates as Lucas steps onto slick tiles, his gaze flicking to the screen's edge, where Denzel's character mirrored his movements but not his soul. The thrill is immediate, but discomfort curves behind it. Judge Sterling Johnson Jr., who once prosecuted the real Lucas, had called the film 1% reality and 99% Hollywood, reminding all who would listen that Lucas was illiterate, vicious, violent, and everything Denzel Washington was not. That line was meant to cut a myth down to human scale, yet the myth persists, shimmering in celluloid. Across town, Richie Roberts wraps his arms around himself in the dim green of a single-occupant condo. He watches himself on screen, the custody battle, the heartbreak, the moral fortress. He shakes his head. Richie Roberts never had a child, he corrects. That and the noble persona sucked up everything real about Frank. Harlem, 1975. The image blooms in monochrome. A winter sun glazing 116th Street, a bus sighing at the curb, a headline fluttering against a lamppost. Country boys, called number 1. Heroin gang is busted. Clipped and taped into a storefront window, archival headline reproduced in New York Magazine, 2000. The camera of memory lingers on cracked pavement and the long shadow of a man in a tailored coat. Then the film breathes and color returns. Harlem, present day, where footsteps echo along the same block, now rimmed with cafes, glassy condos, and murals that turn the old violence into pigment. Steam rises from a hollow cart. Cumin and char meet the cold air, and the blue scrawl of a faded blue magic tag peeks from beneath a new coat of paint like a bruise that won't quite fade. Curiosity hangs in the air. In a neighborhood so determined to be new, why do the ghosts keep their grip? The street remembers more than it says. Storefronts on Malcolm X Boulevard throw back the sky. Upstairs, a co-working loft hums where a numbers joint once kept ledgers under the till. On the corner, the Apollo's marquee glows, and a tourist points a phone at the sign, as if a photograph might catch the undertow of an era. The city's music shifts with the light. Fragments of Bobby Womack's Across 110th Street, snared in a passing car, rubber on asphalt, a trumpet practicing somewhere above a bodega. Mid-block, the 28th Precinct's brick bulk holds steady, the same station that once sent plainclothes out under the banner of the NYPD, Organized Crime Control Bureau, while DEA Group 22 wore grooves into the city's map. Old case files sit behind new glass. The acronyms have changed less than the storefronts. It is easy to say a man made his fortune here and was punished for it. Harder to grasp the harmonics that still ring. Frank Lucas turned Harlem into a marketplace that bypassed the old monopolies, then watched as history pushed him to the margins. His name is not on a plaque, but it floats in the way people talk about the 1970s. How the heroin was clean, how the money moved, how the Italians were circled rather than served. Even the arguments are part of the folklore. Coffins or furniture, 100% purity, or 10 by the time it hit the street. That's because with Blue Magic, you could get 10% purity, he boasted, still selling the legend as late as August 2000, New York Magazine 2000. The boast was a mirror. It showed the man, and it showed the market that wanted his myth. Walk further, and the city revises the frame again. On Park Avenue's schoolyard wall, the Graffiti Hall of Fame layers color over color, memorials to years when a whole generation tried to spell the city into a future. At 128th and 2nd, Keith Haring's Crack is Whack still blazes warning orange, painted in 1986 as the next wave rolled in. This is how a neighborhood keeps score, in names on walls, in songs that outlive arrests, in headlines that refuse to yellow. A retired detective from the old Z team, Eddie Jones, Al Spearman, Benny Abruzzo, might walk past without a glance, or pause only long enough to recall the sound of a wiretap reel settling into silence. It was the largest stash of cash I had ever seen, one agent said of Teaneck in 1975. The shock still bright years later. DEA interview, 1975. Facts harden, memory flickers. The street takes both into the archive of itself. Mid-scene, Harlem again. 116th Street, the present tense, where a food truck exhaust mingles with the sweet smoke of roasted peanuts, and a preacher's bullhorn stitches scripture to the rumble of the 2 train. The city's choreography has changed. Crack ruptured the old hierarchies. Corner crews replaced supply chains. Rico carved ladders into the air and pulled bosses down a rung at a time. The Rockefeller drug laws of 1973 lit a slow fuse that burned hottest in the mid-1980s, when policing strategy shifted and the jail doors began to revolve faster. Modern American History, 2021. Today, the market fractures again. Synthetics eclipse powders. Algorithms do the watching that men in sedans once did. Yet Harlem's commerce, legal and otherwise, keeps its genius for reinvention. The pressure that shaped the old empire now shapes leases and loan applications. Where the counting machines once hummed, a startup tallies subscriptions. Where the stash house was, a Pilates studio calibrates breath. But the city is a palimpsest. In a side street's shadow, a metal roll-down bears a ghosted blue. Half a word, it could be anything to a passerby. But to a certain eye, it is a map pin for a vanished network. A micro detail, barely there. A flake of blue paint caught in the seam of the sidewalk. Something a shoe will grind to dust by evening. Above it, a muralist touches up a figure wielding a saxophone. Paint thinner cuts the winter air. He doesn't look down. He doesn't need to. The neighborhood writes and overwrites without instruction. What did it cost? That question is the quiet bass line beneath the tour, a frequency you feel more than hear. The heroin years carved out families. Overdoses bloomed like bad news, and the morgue doors never stopped swinging. The press kept its tally in ink and astonishment. The raid totals, the bank slips, the lines of seized cash. The courtrooms kept their tally in years. Judge Sterling Johnson Jr., who knew the drug wars from the inside, tried to puncture the glamour decades later. 1% reality and 99% Hollywood, he said, of the myth-making that followed, 2007. The point wasn't pedantry, it was triage. There were bodies behind the montage. And still, Harlem's argument about legacy refuses a single verdict. For some, Lucas's story is emblem and warning. Black entrepreneurial audacity co-opted by vice. The triumph and trap of a man who outmaneuvered inherited gatekeepers only to become one himself. For others, he is only the sum of what he sold. The street accommodates both readings, the way a chord holds dissonance until it resolves. Power status snapshot, seen from the long view. Not king, but cautionary tale, a crown melted down and poured into the mold of a new neighborhood's rent check. Near Lenox Avenue, a barbershop keeps a collage of the century on its back wall. Bumpy, Malcolm, the Apollo in neon, a clipped piece about the country boy's indictments. A man in the chair nods toward the collage and tells his son, "That's our history," meaning danger and genius, harm and hustle, all of it. The boy listens, then looks out the window where a rideshare idles, and asks why the city keeps the old names if it wants new stories. The barber doesn't answer right away. The clippers buzz. Outside, the light shifts, and the storefront glass holds two Harlems for a beat. One reflected, one real. Down on 125th, a woman sells perfumes from a card table. She came here in the 90s, when the corner still shook at night. Now she knows which hours bring tourists, which bring neighbors, which bring the ghosts who walk fast and look straight ahead. She doesn't believe in redemption stories written by studios. She believes in rent due on the first, and a city that asks you to perform your future before you can afford it. She points toward an old tenement with a new awning and says, "That was a problem building," then shrugs like the weather changed, because in a way it did. By afternoon, the subway's breath sweeps up from the 116th Street station, warm, metallic, seasoned with the oil and dust of a century. A saxophone busker chooses "If You Don't Know Me By Now," and the melody unravels up the stairwell. Tour groups angle for the best shot of the Apollo. A school group passes the Studio Museum and leans into the guide's sentence about a movement that began with canvases on kitchen tables. The past, the guide says, is an inheritance and a bill. At the corner of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, the street hitches the story to the wider map. The heroin that once arrived by military cargo found rivals and successors, cocaine clouds, crack vials, pills that rebranded chemical despair. Organized crime learned new software, law enforcement learned new statutes. On the far side of the world, the Golden Triangle's poppy fields gave ground, and then reclaimed it, and then gave again. Proof that supply follows power, the way water finds a slope. In the present tense, fentanyl redraws risk, and the city's sirens learn a new cadence. The moral arithmetic never stops changing. The constant is the body asked to pay. There is no statute of limitations on a neighborhood's memory. The 32nd Precinct's bullpen carries a joke about ghosts who know their way to the holding cells. A retired OCCB detective tells a class of recruits that a good case is mostly listening, and a great one is knowing when not to move. In a church basement on Frederick Douglass Boulevard, a recovery group names the dead and the living in the same breath, then passes a basket for coffee and rent. None of it fits into a montage. All of it is the ledger. As the afternoon thins, the tour of ghosts becomes a walk home. A father pushes a stroller past a brownstone that once ran a 25-cent jukebox. Above the stoop, a tenant waters ivy from a coffee can. On a third-floor sill, a child's drawing catches the light. Sun, two figures, a house with too many windows, taped beside a flyer for a neighborhood cleanup. Down the block, a plaque marks where a jazz club stood before a fire, then a vacant lot, then a pharmacy. The plaque is honest. It names names. It names dates. It refuses to tell you what to think. The last sensory beat arrives with evening. The first hint of rain cools the air, and the smell flares off the pavement the way a match lifts sulfur and sweetens into petrichor. A street vendor folds his table. A bus exhales and takes the hill. A neon open sign warms to red, then clicks off. "See, you are what you are. Either you're somebody or you ain't nobody," the movie's version of Lucas once said. A line that belongs more to a script than to the man. American Gangster, 2007. Harlem disagrees. Here you are what you build, what you break, what you repair, and what the block remembers after you leave. By the time night leans in, the murals brighten against the dark. The Haring wall burns a warning, no one has quite learned to outgrow. The Hall of Fame turns sound into color, into sound again. A city bus rattles past the 28th precinct. In a second-floor window, someone opens a novel and leans into the lamplight. A radio somewhere chooses a station that doesn't play news. Up ahead, the old blue magic tag, what's left of it, catches the rain and looks briefly new, a trick of water and dusk. And then the sky takes the street back. The blue above 116th Street deepens toward violet, and every window gathers a square of twilight like a held breath. The tour has no guide now. It never did. What it has is an opening image, learning to be a closing one, cracked pavement smoothed by rain, the faint echo of footsteps that are only tonight's footsteps, the city listening to itself. The camera of memory tilts up, and the blue darkens to near black, and a single detail cuts the silhouette. Somewhere far from here, a polished coffin latch catches the last of the light and goes quiet, and the night folds, and the long road back to the funeral waits in the dark. The fictional narrative twists real contours, swallows nuance, distorts edges. Inside a corporate screening room, studio lawyers sit impassive as news breaks. Former DEA agents have sued Universal for defamation, claiming the film smears them in its closing text, which suggests Lucas's cooperation led to the convictions of 3/4 of New York City's drug enforcement agency. But reality pinches that claim. No agents were arrested, no convictions followed. A judge would later quash the suit, not because it lacked substance, but because no actual agent was clearly identifiable. On set, Denzel Washington crouches low, matching Lucas's slouch over the table, a subtle touch the real man teaches him through quiet instruction. Lucas watches, mouth tight, aware of the distortion, but moved by the fidelity of gesture. His pride abstains from truth. Suddenly, there's a flash of chaos. Walkie-talkies crackle, assistants shift setups. The sound of celluloid frames and neon markers fills the air. A faint disco line pulses through the background, a score that gently warps memory and fact into a cinematic blur. Critics lined up their pens. Ron Jepeziuk, Lucas's biographer, called the storyline a myth clothed as documentary, urging journalists to double-check sources rather than rely on myth-making. And the New Yorker remarked that while the film was never dull, it lacks moral examination, packaging a criminal enterprise into measured elegance. Yet the cameras keep rolling. Lucas, older now, nods at Washington, who tilts his head back. The shared understanding, one of experience, one of performance, hangs like ambient counsel in the set's hot haze of film lights and lingering popcorn. Late in post-production, editors adjust the final text. A claim of mass corruption among lawmen becomes a regrettable misstatement. Yet the legend settles regardless. The red carpet had already writ the narrative in public consciousness, with rhetoric smoother than facts. The emotional tone sharpens toward betrayal. Lucas's life, violence and ash, risk and strategy, drifts from an account of human risk into cinematic showmanship. The watching public grows enamored, not with his empire's cost, but with its gloss. The man's own legacy becomes a costume. On one of the last takes, Denzel repeats a line born from script but not street. You are what you are in this world. Either you're somebody or you ain't nobody. It hits like a prophecy he's channeling. Yet it isn't Lucas's. The ambient score swells, a Womack track lifted from the soundtrack weaving underneath the clatter of applause. The line between myth and memory bleeds, and Frank Lucas looks away. He steps off set and into the night. The forest of flashbulbs follows, bright, insistent, unforgiving, and frames him in legend, even as he steps into shadow. As the lights dim, the credits roll upward, and the next scene's promise awaits. Black and white archival footage of Harlem in the 1970s, ready to reclaim reality from Hollywood's gloss. The sound comes first, a low metallic click, distinct and deliberate, cutting through the silence like the snap of a trap being set. It is the coffin latch from 1975, the same one we opened this story with, the one that sealed away the man Harlem called both a protector and a predator. Back then, under the harsh July sun, the crowd lined 7th Avenue in their Sunday best and their quietest whispers. Now, the frame darkens, and the latch shifts into a different time, a different place. Cedar Grove, New Jersey, May 30th, 2019. The sky hangs low with swollen clouds. The air is heavy, damp, smelling faintly of wet asphalt and fresh dug earth. Rain begins as a tentative drizzle, tapping against umbrellas and the slick black surface of the hearse. The casket, mahogany and polished to a mirror's shine, reflects the blurred shapes of mourners huddled in small clusters. Some are family, some are old associates, some are just curious faces who drove here to see the final act of a man whose name they only knew from headlines in Hollywood. In the front row, his siblings sit close together, their coats pulled tight against the chill. The years have bent their backs, silvered their hair. Beside them, two men in their 70s lean on canes, speaking in murmurs that fade when they notice the television cameras at the edge of the cemetery. Even now, even here, the story follows him. At the very back, half shadowed by the doorway of the chapel, stands Francine Lucas. She is still, hands folded, eyes locked on the casket, but unfocused, as if she's looking past it, into a time only she can see. The years have given her the composed grace of a woman who has built her own life far from the streets her father once ruled. Yet there's something in the set of her jaw, in the steadiness of her gaze, that speaks of the same quiet steel. Inside, the chapel smells of lilies. They're everywhere, flanking the altar, draped over the casket, set in tall vases by the aisles. Their sweetness is cloying in the enclosed air, mixing with the faint scent of polished wood and rain-soaked wool coats. The organ plays softly, not a hymn, but something almost improvisational, a wandering melody that rises and falls like the weather outside. The officiant, a pastor from a local Baptist church, speaks of redemption and of a life judged by its entirety, not its worst chapters. His voice is steady, warm, but each word seems to stir a different memory in the room. For some, it is the image of a man doling out Thanksgiving turkeys in Harlem in the 1970s. For others, it is the grainy newspaper photo of his arrest, his head bowed as federal agents lead him down courthouse steps. When it is Francine's turn to speak, the room stills. She walks to the lectern slowly, the sound of her heels sharp against the wooden floor. She glances once at the casket, then at the rows of faces watching her. "My father," she begins, voice quiet but unwavering, "was complicated. I grew up in a world where there was always enough. Enough food, enough money, enough security. But I didn't know where it came from. I didn't ask. And when I found out, I had to learn how to live with two versions of him. The man who walked me to school, who made me laugh, and the man I read about in the papers, who people said destroyed lives. For a long time, I didn't know which was real. I guess I still don't. But I know this. He loved me, and I loved him." Her voice catches on the last words. She pauses, breathes in the heavy floral air, and adds softly, "That guy they talk about, the one with the drugs and the guns, that was some other person, not my dad." She steps down, not looking at the cameras that track her back to her seat. The sound of the rain swells for a moment, filling the silence. The pastor resumes, reading a short verse, then nods to the pallbearers. They rise, 6 men who each carry a part of the casket's weight, their hands in white gloves. As they lift, the wood gleams under the dim chapel lights. The air seems to thicken. Outside, the rain falls harder, pinging against the hearse roof in quick, uneven beats. From the chapel door to the burial plot is only a few yards, but each step feels slowed, as if the procession is moving through water. The umbrellas bloom open one by one, the black garden swaying in the wind. The cemetery grass is slick, the earth beneath it soft from the week's rain. A small crowd edges forward to watch as the casket is lowered into place. There is no loud sobbing, no wailing, just the occasional cough, the shifting of feet, the rustle of coat fabric. And then, as if cued by something unspoken, a murmur begins among a few of the older men, a line they've heard him say 100 times, back in the days when deals were struck in diners and on street corners. "The most important thing in business," one says quietly, "is honesty." Another picks it up. "Integrity, hard work, family," comes from somewhere near the back. "Never forgetting where we came from," finishes a voice that trembles with age. It's not clear if they mean it as tribute or irony. Maybe both. As the final shovelful of earth lands on the casket, the scene shifts in memory. Harlem, summer of 1975. 7th Avenue, alive with the hum of thousands. The same air heavy with heat and grief. The brass bands swelling, the detectives watching, that coffin latch closing. In the documentary's arc, this is where we began, with a man at the height of his myth, sealed away in the ground but still holding the streets in his grasp. Now, in 2019, the myth feels smaller. The crowd is thinner, the streets are far away, and the only grasp left is that of history. We move through the years in quick flashes. The deals, the busts, the courtroom glares, the prison gates closing, the wheelchair, the disability check, the red carpet, the interviews. Faces age, voices fade. Harlem changes, Cedar Grove changes, the country changes. The center cannot hold forever. And yet, the questions remain. Was he the kingpin who poisoned his own community? Or the strategist who outplayed the mafia at their own game? Was he the family man who protected his own? Or the calculating businessman who left a trail of destruction? The pastor offers a final prayer. The umbrellas begin to close. The mourners drift toward their cars, their voices low, their footsteps soft in the wet grass. Francine lingers a moment longer by the grave, her hand resting briefly on the slick wooden surface before it disappears under the earth. She whispers something we cannot hear. Then she turns and walks away, her black coat cutting a dark line against the pale stone markers. In the end, there are no answers here. Only the weight of a life lived at the extremes, of love and loyalty, of violence and ambition, of legacy both celebrated and condemned. The rain eases. The clouds shift, letting a muted light spill over the cemetery. The lilies tremble in the breeze. The camera holds on the grave, the name carved in granite, the dates that bracket a life. And over it, the voice. His voice. From an old interview, recorded years before. The most important thing in business is honesty, integrity, hard work, family, never forgetting where we came from. The words hang there, caught between truth and fiction, between memory and myth, as the screen fades to black.